Welcome to Module 1.2 of Binance Academy's Blockchain Deep Dive course. In this module, we'll explore how crypto transactions are created, authenticated, and validated on the blockchain. The main purpose of the blockchain is to maintain a secure, transparent, and tamper-resistant record of transactions. Transactions are digital records of events such as transfers of value or information between parties. They are the fundamental units of data that are stored within blocks. A crypto transaction on the blockchain typically contains these core components: a transaction hash, signature, the sender's address, the recipient's address, and the amount of cryptocurrency being transferred. A transaction hash, or transaction ID, is a unique identifier for the transaction generated by hashing the transaction data. Similar to the block hash, it allows a transaction to be easily located and referenced. For instance, you can find and review any one of the 3,264 transactions inside Bitcoin, block 785,390, by searching their transaction hash. The signature refers to a cryptographic digital signature generated by the sender using their private key. The sender's address is usually the public key or identifier of the person initiating the transaction. Similarly, the recipient's address is usually the public key of the person receiving the funds. Lastly, the transaction information will include the quantity of cryptocurrency or data being transferred in the transaction. Transaction data also include transaction fees, a timestamp, and other information. While transaction data may vary across the various blockchain networks, they generally include these fundamental details. In any system that involves the digital transfer of value, bad actors may attempt to commit fraud or exploit vulnerabilities for personal gain. That's why most blockchain systems employ cryptographic methods such as asymmetric cryptography, also known as public key cryptography, to safeguard and authenticate transaction data. Public key cryptography uses two different but mathematically related keys, a public key and a corresponding private key. Each user generates a pair of keys, a public key, which can be freely shared, and a private key, which must be kept secret. When someone wants to send a message to another party, they encrypt the message using the recipient's public key. Upon receiving the encrypted message, the recipient can decrypt it using their private key. This provides a secure method for communication and data transfer between parties confidentially and securely. Both Bitcoin and Ethereum use the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, or ECDSA, as its public key cryptography system. ECDSA generates a private key and a public key, where the private key is used for signing transactions and the public key is used to verify those signatures. One thing to note is that the Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchains store data in a public, transparent, and easily verifiable manner. While the data itself is not encrypted, the integrity and security of the transactions are maintained using cryptographic techniques. Let's look at an example. Alice wants to send 1 Bitcoin to Bob. Alice and Bob each have a unique pair of public and private keys. Let's say Alice's public key is PubKey Alice, Alice's private key is PrivKey Alice, and Bob's public key is PubKey Bob. Alice creates a transaction stating that she wants to send 1 Bitcoin to Bob. The transaction includes the input, amount, and output of the transaction Alice has initiated. Here's a breakdown of how this information is laid out. Input: the source of the 1 Bitcoin that Alice is sending, which usually comes from a previous transaction where Alice received Bitcoin. Amount: 1 Bitcoin. Output: Bob's public key, which indicates that the 1 Bitcoin will be sent to Bob's address. Alice signs the transaction using her private key. This process generates a digital signature unique to the transaction. The digital signature serves as proof that the transaction was created by Alice and that it hasn't been tampered with. Alice broadcasts the signed transaction to the Bitcoin network. Next, nodes in the network validate the transaction by checking the digital signature using Alice's public key. Since only Alice's private key could have generated the valid signature, the network confirms that the transaction is authentic and was indeed created by Alice. Once validated, the transaction is included in a new block by miners. This block is then added to the blockchain, making the transaction a part of the public ledger. Once the transaction is confirmed, Bob would receive the 1 Bitcoin from Alice. Miners validate the Merkle root to ensure the integrity of all transactions within a given block. For example, by examining the Merkle root of Bitcoin block 785,390, miners can verify the validity of its 3,264 transactions. This process is facilitated by a data structure known as a Merkle tree. A Merkle tree is generated by iteratively hashing pairs of data nodes, commonly referred to as leaves, until only a single final hash remains, called the Merkle root. Remember the avalanche effect of the hashing function? This applies to Merkle leaves too. A slight alteration in any of the leaves or the data within a transaction results in drastic changes to their hash and, consequently, the Merkle root. By checking the Merkle root, nodes can efficiently ensure the data integrity of all transactions within the block. To summarize this process, transactions on a blockchain are created by users, broadcasted to the blockchain network, processed by miners, and verified through consensus mechanisms, which are the subject of the next module. We will delve into how the blockchain network reaches agreement among all participating nodes.